on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. And yes, that's right, folks. We're back with the Truth Attack. Gee, I got my camera focused a little bit wrong here. Let's get that straightened out. Okay. So we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the topics, the lectures, the discussions, particularly on the income tax and the maladministration of it by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower courts for the last 60 years, you should find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month, every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the broadcast network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on the maladministration of the income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower courts, you find your way over to taxfreedom.com. That's hard. And IRSzoom.com. Taxfreedom.com, of course, is my free educational website where you can get educated on the statutes, the laws, the history, the Constitution, and the Supreme Court's decisions controlling all federal taxation, including the new Moore decision, well, it was new as of last year in June, which 100% contradicts every single circuit court's holdings on income tax for the last 50 years. Moore displaces all of the erroneous precedents the circuit courts have been holding up to the American people to deceive them into believing that an income tax is owed on your labor as a function of a direct tax authorized by the 16th Amendment, which is a complete and total constitutional fraud because the Supreme Court tells us in Moore that one, income taxes are indirect under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and that the 16th Amendment is actually part of that indirect constitutional foundation. It is not a new power to tax directly and without limitation the labors of the American people. And two, the court tells us in Moore that all direct taxes must still be apportioned to the states for payment in proportion to the census, their share of the last census, which means that if for the last 50 years it has been a direct tax, they've been unconstitutionally enforcing it against individuals instead of the several states. So as a direct tax, it's completely unconstitutional. As an indirect tax, it doesn't exist as an imposed duty or excise that touches the labors of the American people. The income tax has been a constitutional fraud since World War II, when they first began enforcing a tax, the victory tax, against the labors of the American people. Previous to the victory tax, the labors of the American people had not been subject to federal taxation, other than perhaps by Social Security, which has a little interesting history that I'll go into a little bit. In the first Social Security Act, the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional, outside the orbit of congressional power to worry about the future concerns of the American people. That's their business, not the government's. A Social Security system was deemed outside the orbit of congressional powers. So, having a Social Security program stricken down by the Supreme Court, Franklin Roosevelt quietly went to the justices and threatened to add 9 new liberal justices to the court. And after that threat was made, surprise, the second Social Security Act was allowed to stand as a tax on labor. Oh, isn't that surprising? Threaten the court and it changes its mind. Previous to the threat, there is no tax on labor. It's outside the orbit of federal authority. But after they're threatened, all of a sudden they find a way to do it. And this, of course, begins the court's perversion and subversion by sedition of the 16th Amendment, enforcing it and teaching it as a direct tax without limitation that unleashed the beast to feed off of the American people and their productivity. No tax is authorized. No tax is allowed. Labor isn't a valid subject of federal taxation. And they've been lying to you about it. And they know they've been lying because the reason why they had to argue for the last 75 years that it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment is because they were admitting there's no taxation of labor as impost, duty, or excise. Flint v. Stone Tracy set the rule, and the Supreme Court started to break it with this decision in the second Social Security legislation cases, because as I said, the first Social Security Act was deemed unconstitutional, and they came right back with another one, and Roosevelt threatened the courts, and the courts allowed it on a voluntary subscription basis. So, the income tax is a complete and total fraud. The Moore Supreme Court decision a year ago in June ends the enforcement of the tax in the courts as a direct unapportioned tax. And since the IRS has been enforcing it for 55 years and is still enforcing it today on the very direct basis, and only on the direct basis, of your earning money deemed to be, or redefined under the statute, as gross income, federally taxable gross income under Section 61 and 63. The Section 63 being taxable income defined as gross income, and gross income being defined as all earnings from all sources listed in Section 61, which was never enacted as domestic legislation. Section 61 was not part of the original Tax Act enacted in 1913 under the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, which was the original income tax. It's a tariff collected at the source from foreign persons. It was never a domestic tax on labor. In 1918, 5 years later, they added a Canadian tax treaty, Part 519 of Title 26, and it's that part under which Section 61 came into being as part of the tax treaty legislation in 1918. At that time, it was Section 22A of the 1920 Code going forward. And Section 22A became Section 61 in 1954. And at that point in time, the Supreme Court and Commissioner v. Glenshaw Glass either lost track of or intentionally and seditiously omitted the fact that the 16th Amendment doesn't authorize a direct tax on all earnings. It authorizes a limited income tax on impost, duty, and excise taxable activities, and the Supreme Court ignored the limited application under the Canadian Tax Treaty and held that Section 61 authorized that direct tax under the 16th Amendment on all accessions to wealth. Now, how they get from impost, duty, and excise to a tax on all accessions to wealth of the American people is insane. The only way to get there is to hold it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which is nonsense. It can't be interpreted as a direct tax because the word direct isn't in the amendment. And if it is interpreted as a direct tax, that would be the creation of a new power to tax, directly and without apportionment or proportionate imposition of the tax. Previous to the 16th Amendment, all direct taxes had to be apportioned to the states for payment under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and imposed proportionately to the state share of the census under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. The 16th Amendment does not contain the word direct, and if it's interpreted as allowing a direct tax, that interpretation engineers an irreconcilable conflict with the pre-existing clauses that were not repealed or amended controlling direct taxation. And of course, you can't use law to destroy law, particularly not interpretively. And it is specifically for these reasons that the Supreme Court ruled in 1916 in the original income tax cases of Bershaber v. Union Pacific Railroad and Stanton v. Baltic Mining that no new powers were created, no new subjects are created. It's an extension or an application of the indirect taxing powers where income is not the object of the tax. It's not the subject of taxation. It is the yardstick, the mechanism by which the amount of tax owed is measured. But tax is only owed on revenues derived from federally taxable activities subject to impost, duty, and excise. Imposts tax foreign persons, foreign imports, and in foreign places like the territories and possessions. Imposts do not tax the domestic labor of American citizens, and the original income tax legislation was a tariff act, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, which is one form of an impost which taxes foreign persons, and thus we have the collection of the tax at the source by the withholding agents only from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations because it's a tariff. And that's how the tax is reflected in the law through the 1939 code, and that document is available on the taxfreedom.com website if you want to download a copy of it and see for yourself what classes of persons were made subject to the income tax from 1913 through 1942 when the victory tax appeared. So you have Section 61 being fraudulently used to create a direct basis through gross income for the application of the direct income tax under the 16th Amendment, which doesn't authorize a direct tax. Everything the circuit courts have done to the American people for 75 years is pure constitutional fraud and sedition. The judges have lied to you. They have betrayed their oath to enforce the Constitution, and they have, instead of enforcing constitutional taxation by impost, duty, and excise, they've been enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which reads a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation, is in the Communist Manifesto, designed to divide the population into different classes and set them at warfare with one another, which of course is what we see playing out on our streets today, isn't it? The violence of class warfare, the rich against the poor, the black against the white, the young against the old, the Christian versus the Jew, or the Muslim, or the Buddhist. It's all class warfare, right from the Communist Manifesto, which is exactly why the Constitution requires uniformity of all indirect taxation. But they've perverted that uniformity to mean geographical uniformity. And we're going to talk about that a bit in the second session here coming up. There's only a couple minutes left here. Let's switch out and talk a little bit about what we got happening. Isn't it refreshing, finally, to see a president that can talk to the American people and take questions, more than one staged, prearranged question, for hours and days? Trump is there every day taking question after question after question. Joe Biden was so senile he couldn't talk or understand the questions that were being posed. The man was a dementia patient from day one, and I told you that 5 years ago that he wasn't fit to hold office. Everything that's coming out now in the press about his mental dysfunction and inability to process information or recognize people or know what he was signing or even get up out of bed in the morning and last longer than 11 a.m. before calling a halt to the day's activities. Isn't it refreshing to finally see a president that takes questions from foreign reporters, American reporters, and puts the reporters in their place when they ask stupid questions designed to push an agenda and not actually extract any useful information? Okay, I think I hear that first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We do need your support, but find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website. Get signed up as a subscribing member. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. And, before I get back into a continuing discussion on income tax issues I want to talk about today, let's spend a little bit more time on current events, maybe some historical review. As I was saying, it certainly is nice to finally have a president that will take questions and answer questions intelligently, both at home and away, for hours, not just one prearranged question. And, of course, his tariff strategy is succeeding. I know. Everybody says, oh, he backed off. Well, he put the tariffs in place to assume a position of strength, to force the other countries to come to the table. And lo and behold, it's working. A number of countries, over 30, have all come to the table seeking to cut new deals where Trump is going to make them drop their tariffs on American goods in exchange for not putting back in place the tariffs that he gave them a 90-day break on. And it's working. The UK signed a deal and the market ran. And now China has come to the table. Why has China come to the table? They said they weren't going to negotiate. They weren't going to take tariffs. They put 110% tariff on America. Well, you know what that does? That makes Chinese energy and Chinese food get more expensive because those are the only things we send to China, really. Energy and food. You tariff our imports and you make your own people's food and energy more expensive. And of course, without the American market to sell all that Chinese merchandise into, manufactured with slave labor, they can't sell anything because America, I think, was like 65-70% of Chinese sales in the markets. And without our sales, the Chinese factories were laying people off and closing. China's headed at 80 miles an hour into a deep recession. If none of their products sell, none of their products leave the country. The ships don't get loaded, they don't get sent, they don't get paid. So the Chinese factories are closing down and seeing their economy imploding. The Chinese government decided to come to the table and negotiate with Trump. And I'm sure they'll work out some sort of a deal acceptable to Trump because they have to have our markets to sell into, and we don't really need theirs. Theirs are nice to have because we make good money there, but they need us more than we need them. And of course, his policies have already brought oil down. Last week it was below $60. Right now it's hanging right at $61, but it will get back down again below 60, and the price of gas and diesel fuel will come down, diminishing inflation and reducing recession possibilities, because as energy and the price of energy comes down, more people can afford to work, more companies can afford to do things with the energy. So the tariff strategy is working. China has come to the deal. The stock market is entirely and completely recovered and is now on the verge of another upward boom because, in addition, Trump has also secured something like $4 or $5 trillion in foreign investment over the next 10 years in the United States as more and more companies and countries shift their manufacturing to the U.S. to avoid the possibility of having to pay tariffs on foreign goods in the future. So the tariff policy has worked. The economy is being reset. The global trade system is being reset because Trump was right. The rest of the world was taking advantage of America, dumping its products into our country without penalty, while not allowing our products to be sent into theirs, denying us the market and dumping, well, in China's case, slave labor manufactured goods into the marketplace. So it's all being reset, and it needed to be reset because 37 trillion and counting just can't be allowed to keep running at 2 trillion a year. They're running out the currency. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. A strong currency ensures a high quality of life. A weak currency ensures poverty and depression. There are examples all over the planet of both situations. Now let's look at what the Democrat priorities are in the party right now. They're arguing for the defense of criminal, illegal cartel gang members? You're kidding me. That's your big agenda item? Criminal cartel gang members and their freedom and being brought back to America. Not just due process in the courts in America. Bring them back. Bring them back. We need more criminal cartel terrorists here in America. That seems to be the Democrats' motto. And how did their programs go when they were in office? Well, let's take a look. What did they do? They took $7.5 billion, or put $7.5 billion into their infrastructure bill for new EV chargers. And that $7.5 billion built seven EV charger stations for $7.5 billion. Who got all that money? Which Democrat donor was it that owned that company? Total fraud. Steal the money. No EV chargers. Some infrastructure bill. $1 billion per station. Oh, there's something Doge should eliminate. And how about the rural internet? The rural internet, $42 billion for rural internet. And they hooked up less than 10,000 people. I don't think they hooked up anybody. But they must have hooked up something. But for $42 billion, they gave us no rural internet. Virginia still hasn't gotten anything. This was a big item on Representative, what's her name there, 7th District. Well, it was a big deal in Virginia, and nothing got done. Nothing got done. Total fraud. And all that infrastructure money on solar panels and solar farms and windmills, they didn't spend a cent. They didn't spend a cent on updating the air traffic control system of the FAA. No, infrastructure that actually needed to be maintained in order to maintain air travel all over the United States. That they just ignored. They spent $7 billion on 7 EV stations and $42 billion on air for rural internet, and canceled the contract for rural internet with the one company that was actually doing it. Starlink. Elon Musk. Oh no, Elon Musk. No, we can't use his company. He's the only one who's doing it. So they gave the $42 billion to companies that didn't do it instead. Now that's the Democrat plan. Throw it to the wind and hope your friends are there to catch it. Because the contracts are aimed at them, so they will be. So we got no infrastructure. We got nothing but waste, fraud, and abuse from the Democrats' green agenda and infrastructure bill. It was all fraud. It was all nonsense. It was all looting the treasury and passing out funds to their supporters. And of course, running out the currency. Absolutely sick. Absolutely sick. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this construct of uniformity of indirect taxation, which has been perverted by the courts into geographical uniformity. And by geographical uniformity, what they mean is that it's okay to have non-uniform taxation, i.e. tax brackets with different rates of tax on different groups of persons, as long as the tax is geographically uniform. That means you can tax the rich at a higher rate than the poor, as long as you tax the rich in New York, California, Texas, and Florida the same in all 50 states, not just the 4. And as long as you tax the poor the same in all 50 states. But this is a perverted and seditious, unauthorized application and degradation of the uniformity requirement. And here's why. If you research the use of graduated tax brackets, you'll find that it goes back to a series of decisions in the late 1800s, 1860 through 1890, where the Supreme Court ruled that graduated tax brackets were okay to use as long as you had geographical uniformity, because the different brackets, the different rates of tax were authorized because Congress has the power to discriminate against the commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax in the 1880s, and to discriminate against the inanimate, privileged corporate person and the licensed and foreign persons, based on the power to discriminate against those privileged persons depending upon the amount of return they realized through the enjoyment of the privilege they enjoyed. The corporate privilege, the licensed privilege, the privilege of being a foreign party allowed to earn money in the United States. So the court ruled that Congress has the power to discriminate against those commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax, and to discriminate against the corporate person, the licensed person, and the foreign person. But I ask you, what authority does Congress have to discriminate against the citizen? Any? No, none whatsoever. And if we test this theory of geographical uniformity, what we find is that it would theoretically allow for Congress to pass a law that taxes Jews at 100%, Muslims at 100%, and Christians at 0%. And as long as all the Muslims and Jews are taxed the same in every state, and all the Christians are taxed the same in every state, this concept of geographical uniformity is perfectly okay. Now, what do you think? Think they're allowed to tax Jews more than Christians? Are they allowed to tax whites less than blacks, or vice versa? Are they allowed to tax men more than women, young more than the old, male more than female, straight more than gay? Can Congress discriminate against the American people on any of these bases? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The United States Congress does not possess an authority to discriminate against the American people based on wealth or income, any more than they have the right to discriminate against the American people based on age, religion, gender, sexual preference, national origin. None of these characteristics are a valid basis for Congress to discriminate in law against the American people. Graduated taxation is patently unconstitutional when applied and enforced against the American citizen rather than the corporate person, the licensed person, or the foreign person that impost, duty, and excise taxes apply to. If the income tax is an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, as asserted by the Supreme Court and more, then it applies as an impost to foreign activity, foreign persons, and in foreign places. If it's a duty, it applies to exported goods. If it's an excise, it applies to commodities, licenses, and corporations. Nowhere does the impost, duty, or excise taxing powers apply to labor of the American people conducted by right. So, okay, I think I hear the next commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I do want to urge the members of the audience to find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website. Get signed up as a monthly subscribing member and get over to taxfreedom.com. Get educated, and if you need help dealing with the IRS or the Department of Justice, that help is available at irszoom.com. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. Let's just get right back into it. When we came up on that commercial break, I was talking about how the Uniformity Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, controlling all indirect taxation, requiring uniformity of tax within those three indirect powers of impost, tax foreign activity, foreign imports, and in foreign places like the possessions and territories or in foreign countries under tax treaties. It includes the power to tax by duty, which is the power to tax exported goods, only exported goods, only foreign persons and activities by impost, only exported goods by duty. Neither impost or duty can tax the labor of the American people performed within the 50 states. It simply isn't possible. Impost taxes foreign activity, duty taxes exported goods. Not theoretically possible to tax the labor of the American people under those two powers. That leaves us with only the excise power as the third power to tax indirectly. And excises tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, licenses to pursue certain occupations, and the corporate privilege. This is the Supreme Court in 1911. Commodities, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, petroleum fuels, licenses to sell those things or transport petroleum fuels across state lines, and the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege of dealing with commodities or having that license or being a corporation, the privilege of incorporation, that is the subject of the tax. It is the privilege that is the subject of the tax. There is no privilege, federal, state, or otherwise, involved with the exercise of your right to work. It fundamentally doesn't fit into the excise taxing power. But when the Supreme Court allowed the second Social Security Act to tax the labor of the American people, the labor unions got scared. They went right to Congress, and they lobbied Congress to pass Title 15, Section 17, which says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. And if it's not a commodity or article of commerce, it is removed from subjectivity to excise taxation, which only taxes commodities and articles of commerce. And privileged persons, or privileges granted to the person by the federal government, i.e. the license or the power or the incorporation. So excise by law cannot apply to labor, because the only way to get to the taxation of labor is to argue that labor is a commodity subject to taxation by excise, which taxes commodities and articles of commerce. So if labor is a commodity, you can tax it by excise. But if labor is not a commodity nor an article of commerce, then there is no arguable basis to make it subject to any excise tax. By law, there is no arguable basis. The only arguable foundation is removed from consideration by the statute. Title 15, Section 17. Go look it up. So impost taxes foreign persons and foreign labor, and that's why withholding agents withhold money as tax from payments made to non-resident aliens for salaries and wages. And that's why that's in 1441B, compensation, salaries, and wages. Three distinct separate sources of earnings subject to income tax when earned by a non-resident alien individual. And we go over to Section 61, and salaries and wages aren't there. So how are salaries and wages of a citizen deemed subject to tax as gross income when they're not listed in Section 61? Would that be judicial legislation? Some judge making it up and adding words that weren't there, aren't put there by Congress? And in fact, they were actually removed by Congress, because Section 61 existed before 1954 as Section 22A. In 1954, they recodified the statutes, and a recodification is simply a reorganization of the laws to move them all together, because, of course, through 20 years of time, new laws come onto the books, and they have to be added and organized, and after 20 years, you may need to slightly reorganize the laws to keep everything together for ease of use by attorneys in researching legal issues. So the law was recodified in 1939, 1954, and 1986. So from 1939 to 1953, Section 61 existed as Section 22A in the 1939 Code. And Section 22A, from 1920, when it first appeared as part of the Canadian Tax Treaty signed in 1918. It took them a year and a half to get the law into the books and published. When it first appeared as 22A, it taxed compensation, salaries, and wages. It taxed the labor of persons because it only applied to persons in Canada and could tax by impost under the treaty the labor of Americans in Canada, which isn't conducted by right. It's conducted by virtue of the privilege of being protected by the tax treaty the government signed with Canada. So salaries, wages, and compensation, all three sources were taxable under Section 22A because it applied only to earnings in Canada under the treaty. In 1954, when Section 22A was recodified from 22A to Section 61, miraculously, salaries and wages got removed from the code section. So it now only taxes compensation, not salaries and wages. Now, this may seem like a mere form issue because salaries and wages, arguably, are a form of compensation. So if compensation is taxed, could you say salaries and wages are? Well, wait a minute. Let's step back. Can a corporation earn salaries and wages? No. Salaries and wages can only be earned by an individual, not a corporation. Can a corporation earn compensation? Well, yes, of course. So in leaving compensation in Section 61, was the intent to tax corporate compensation, but not the salaries and wages of the individual, because those two sources were removed in the recodification of the law in 1954? And they removed them so they wouldn't have a patently unconstitutional statute attempting to tax the labor of the American people, because they intended to start using Section 61 as the alleged basis for the continuation of the unlimited direct tax they'd started to enforce under the victory tax. And of course, it didn't take long, did it? The Supreme Court took it up in 1955, 1 year later, in Commissioner versus Glenshaw Glass, and completely lost track of the limited application and said 61 allows the taxation by Congress of all accessions to wealth of the American people. Any money you make, everything you do is now taxable to the federal government as a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, through gross income being the basis for the application of the tax to all sources of earnings, regardless of whether they were federally taxable before 1954 or World War II or not. We don't care if it wasn't imposed before. Now it is, because we're making it up through judicial legislation. The judges said it's an accession to all wealth, not Congress. The judges made it a tax on labor, not Congress. The judges did it all. They put salaries and wages in with judicial legislation. What kind of judges? Communist bastards. That's what kind of judges. Seditious communist bastards, undermining the Constitution they swore an oath to uphold, and instead choosing to enforce their own personal, political, communistic, socialist beliefs under the Communist Manifesto. That only government can manage all of your affairs. Because you The people are too stupid to do anything right without government managing it for you. So now you're a slave. Any money you make, the government wants a piece. Can you understand how absolutely intolerable and inconceivable it would have been to the founding fathers that every time an American earned a dollar, he owed a portion of it to the federal government? Nobody understands that. Nobody understands that how absolutely tyrannical and despotic the founding fathers would have found this, which is why they prohibited it. No direct taxation of the people, not their person, not their property, not their revenue. Revenue had always been considered, or a tax on revenue had always been considered a direct tax. You're taxing the person and his labor. There's no avoiding it. There's no escape. How is that not direct? Of course it's direct. And it's unconstitutionally graduated when imposed on citizens. It has to be uniform. You can't treat the rich Jews different than the poor Christians. You're literally creating brackets around religious practices almost. Just it doesn't say that. It says, how much money did you make? That's not a valid basis for discriminating against the American people. You have a right to earn. You have a right to exercise your right to work, to stay alive, to eat, house, educate your own family. Absolutely inconceivable to the founding fathers that every single time an American earned a dollar, he would owe tax to the federal government. This is as unconstitutional as it gets. It's got nothing to do with either direct taxation as authorized under the Constitution or indirect taxation as authorized under the Constitution. It is out and out the outright imposition of the second plank of the Communist Manifesto to steal from your wallet the fruits of labor and proceeds that should fund your life and the causes that you believe in, and they reach into your pocket and steal it before you ever take it home in order to force you to fund whatever nonsense they're talking about this administration. All fraud, all lies, all unconstitutional, all perpetrated by seditious, treasonous judges who've thrown the American people into the wilderness to die at the hands of the highway robbers of the wolves. All unconstitutional. Okay, I think I hear that final break coming up. Again, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I urge you to get over to the taxfreedom.com website, get educated on all of this material. We've gotten through the direct-indirect question. There's just a couple other things to go, and this whole tax system comes down on its head. The writing's on the wall. I thought I heard the break. What's going on? Okay, I'm going to guess that's it. I don't hear the music coming up here. Oh, there it is. I thought I heard it earlier. What's the delay there? Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website. Get signed up as a subscribing member. We need your help to keep the network operating and the broadcast coming. We'll be back next week with more on more. Very good. Stop recording.